So a very good morning to everyone. My name is Karina Kwok, and I'm the Head of Professional Practices and Community at the Institute for HR Professionals. My team and I support our IHRP community with their continuing professional development, and we partner with the HR ecosystem to share knowledge nuggets to help enable our HR professionals with their learning journey. Now, as the pandemic ensues and work from home continues to be a default mode of working for most organizations, it is imperative for HR to continue to keep a pulse on its workforce to better understand their state of mind, virtual work and wellness needs, and expectations for their organization leadership during these trying times. Hence, it is our pleasure to co-host this webinar with Qualtrics, who is a global organization offering cloud-based subscription software platform for experience management. Now, before I start introducing the amazing lineup of speakers for today, let me quickly cover some of the webinar ground rules on the next slide. Now, as some of you are quite familiar with the Zoom console by now, you will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but you do see at the bottom, you can see a chat function as well as the Q&A function. So feel free to use the chat function to give a shout out and hello to everyone. But do remember that when you do come to the question and answer segment of today, please use the Q&A forum because that's where we'll be looking out for the questions. And for those who don't have a question to answer, sorry, to send in, but feel like there's a really good question that somebody else has posed, please feel free to use the upvote function to get the questions voted to the top so that we'll get to it first. Now, we may not be able to answer all your questions, so as a heads up, we will be collating them and be answering them, working with the panelists and speakers to answer them, to send it back out to you post the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and be sent to you in about a week's time. And then lastly, hopefully, if you've enjoyed the webinar or have suggestions on other topics you'd like us to cover, please scan the QR code at the end of the webinar to send us some feedback and inputs. We'll greatly appreciate that. Now, let me turn to providing some brief introductions to the wonderful speakers who have given us their time and will be sharing great insights with us later. First up, Lauren Huntington is the Experience Solution Strategist with Qualtrics Southeast Asia. She's a highly experienced organization psychologist, and she's got over a decade of experience working with C-suite and senior management across industries. She's previously worked at SHL and Deloitte and started her career in Africa and have been living in Asia for the past 3 years. She's currently based in Singapore. So very rich global experiences that we'll look forward to her sharing later. Next up, we have Charlton Ong, VP of HR at Singtel. Charlton is VP for Singtel's Group Enterprise Global Business Unit, as well as the lead for the Singapore operations. He partners closely with the senior business leaders to build a fit-for-purpose organization. And as you can see there, he's actually previously worked at HP Services Asia Pacific and also spent some time in Shanghai with Honeywell International. He's passionate about listening and communicating with people and treating one another with care and respect. Next up, we have Cornelius Chang. He's the head of People and Organization Development at Grab. He heads the department where he leads a team that seeks to innovate talent and performance management, people development, and cultural engagement at Grab. And prior to Grab, he was also with the global organization consulting firm McKinsey & Company. Last but not least, we have Dilip Bori. He's the head of employee listening at Standard Chartered Bank. And prior to that, he spent about 12 years consulting with some of the world's best known companies, such as IBM, and also very regional career that he's had. He's worked with clients in EMEA and also later in Japan, APAC. And in his earlier career, he was a research consultant with Roffey Park, based in the UK, where he was at the forefront of their thought leadership publishing papers and articles on HR business partnering, employee engagement, management, and more. So great to have all of you here joining us and giving us your time and sharing. I think I'll now pass it over to Lauren Huntington to give us a quick presentation, exciting insights from their global employee engagement survey. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Karina, for the introduction and for helping us curate such an interesting panel for today. I'm sure you're all very eager to pose a number of questions. So as Karina said, we really encourage you to post those questions to the chat and vote up to the top those ones that you'd really like for the panel to answer towards the end of today's session. I'm going to start by just grounding us in a little bit of the constructs we're going to explore today, then take a bit of a global perspective, zoom that into a more regional perspective, and end off with some Singapore-specific insights. So let's start by talking about engagement more broadly. So we know engagement is actually a very rich construct. It's not about asking me, Lauren, are you feeling engaged? And me saying yes or no. It's about a number of particular outcomes that we're looking to drive from an organizational perspective. So things like discretionary effort. Am I going to put in that extra bit of energy that I need today to be able to over-deliver on my work or really delight my customer? Do I have that true pride in my own work and in my organization that can be felt by others and those around me? Am I likely to advocate of my own volition for my organization? And do I have strong feelings of accomplishment from the types of work that I do? And an important metric that I'm sure many of you on the call keep tabs on within your own organization is, do I feel that this is the organization that is going to support me in terms of both my short-term and longer-term vision for myself and for my career? Now, I'm sure in a lot of ways, I'm going to be preaching to the converted here when we talk about why is employee listening and employee experience more critical than ever. But I thought this is useful sort of construct to start to ground the discussion before we get into some of the study results. So firstly, we know that the business value of EX has been now well established. Both in external studies, so if you look at reports by Forrester, for example, if you look at some Gartner reports that show that engaged employees are likely to bring 3 times more revenue growth, engaged employee workforces have lower turnover and more productivity. We also see great case studies from our own client organizations, and we're eager to share a couple of snippets of those as we go through today. The second is we know that against the backdrop of all of the significant change that we've seen, both from the pandemic, from the rise of digitization and a more connected world, we can no longer have a static view of what drives engagement. We need to be at the top of what are some of those emerging constructs and drivers that we need to keep tabs on. And a couple of those that we're going to start working towards in a moment are around things like well-being and belonging. The third is we need to recognize that we have very diverse employee segments and those have varying needs. So having sort of a unidimensional view about sort of an engagement score across an entire workforce is no longer useful for us in being able to close the gap between those kinds of experiences we want employees to have and the ones that they report having on the ground. We know within Singapore and within APAC more broadly, we still have a big opportunity to leapfrog in terms of a number of those indices that our study sees as critical. So while we've certainly seen improvements year on year that are really encouraging, there is more work to do. And then finally, there's a big opportunity for us to go all in when it comes to action. So we know that many of you listening in may already have sort of various checkpoints and data points within your own employee workforce. And certainly that's the start and the foundation of your listening program, but being able to translate that into insight and being able to have that insight turn into action as quickly as possible is a key part of one of the themes we'll be exploring today as well. So without further ado, let me dive us into the global study that Qualtrics conducted. So this was not a once-off. This is a study we have been doing for several years. And this was done on over 11,000 individuals across the globe. If you are interested in reading more detail of the study, of course, there's a lot of rich insight that came out of this, and there's only so much we can cover off in one webinar. I encourage you to refer to some of the further reading that's listed here and that we'll give you access to after this webinar. So let's start with the headline results. What are the major drivers of engagement globally? So you're going to see some here that have been constructs that we've potentially been measuring and have been invested in for a number of years. But for the first time, and not as a surprise, we see coming to the fore belonging and corporate social responsibility. So belonging being individuals reporting that sense of connectedness, both to their teams and to the organizational vision more broadly. From a corporate social responsibility perspective, being proud of the fact that your own organization has a positive impact on the world. Now, while these are themes that we've been talking about in the HR community for a long time, it's often been seen as something that is not necessarily a priority, is maybe a nice to have, or one of the common myths we hear is actually this is something that just millennials are more interested in. And what's been great about last year's study is we now have the data to back up that these are actually key themes that are driving some of those key outcomes, right from intention to stay to advocacy that I spoke about right at the beginning of this presentation. So while we won't have time to deep dive all of this, I'd love to start just by chatting about the two key themes that emerged as the biggest drivers. So I'm going to start by talking about corporate social responsibility and then dive us into this really critical theme of belonging. So I mentioned that we have been dealing with the myth for some time that actually corporate social responsibility is something that is more of a millennial concern. Now you can see here that the data bears out that in fact there's actually strong interest in this, or this is something that when employees report that they feel that the CSR initiatives from their organizations are authentic and have real impact on the societies in which they operate, that has correlations with those key engagement outcomes that we're looking for across all of those generational divides. So really more than ever, we're seeing that there's an opportunity here to invest, to get employees involved. And we saw some great examples of that during COVID, where organizations who had workforces that perhaps were not able to operate in the same way, they were able to pivot some of those individuals to be able to, for example, volunteer in their own societies to support with governmental efforts in responding to the pandemic. The next big theme that we saw arise was around belonging. So you can see here that there's a huge differential between those individuals that feel that they belong and those that they do not. So for those employees that reported to us globally that they are engaged, 81% of those felt that they belonged within organizations. So if there was one key theme that you had to take away from today and you had to start talking about to your executive team, or you had to start reframing what's a lot of what you may be doing around, I would be asking myself the question as an HR and as an organizational practitioner, what are the things that we are doing to make sure that we are consistently creating and fostering this sense of belonging in our own organization. Now, in order to sort of bring a lot of this to life, we're going to bring in our panel members to talk about from their own organizational perspective, how have they seen this theme play out, and what are some key actions that they're taking as well. Now, importantly, this theme of belonging, we're going to see sort of come up but in both the global, the regional, and the local findings. So for those of you that are perhaps representing organizations that are Singapore-based or across APAC, we actually see this theme hold true throughout those different contexts. So I'm going to ask here for us to have a look at a great example from Singtel of a robust and mature employee experience program, which has multiple listening channels across multiple touch points in the employee lifecycle, as well as has been managed to pivot during times of change, to lean in, to listen to critical aspects that is, or aspects of feedback that are needed from the workforce. So Charlton is here as a representative from Singtel. Charlton, if I can ask you to come online, that's great. So we've really enjoyed working together with you at Qualtrics to mature this program over time, and we're really excited about the work that you're doing. So I'd love to hear from you how you would describe how your employee experience program helps create a sense of belonging in Singtel, especially against the backdrop of such a challenging year like 2020.
Yes. Thank you, Lauren. And thanks for having me, everyone. And, good morning as well to everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. Otherwise, please put up your hand. In fact, at Singtel, the Singtel HR leadership team, we talked about the importance of employee experience in creating a sense of belonging as far back as 3-4 years ago. And at the time, we were half joking among ourselves about how HR people are inherently not good marketeers of our own programs and initiatives, and maybe we should just build an internal HR marketing function. And over the years, we realized that it's not just about marketing our own products and solutions to our internal customers, it's also about creating that user experience as well. And in our case, that's our employees' experience. We then looked at designing or redesigning our HR policies and digitizing our processes progressively with the employee experience at the back of our mind, right? That's different from when you design policies just for the sake of, what HR thinks, but or what the company wants, but not exactly, how that's going to benefit the user, which is our employees. And I think COVID just gave us the opportunity to bring forward many plans and initiatives and expedite their rollout, and as well as double down on the use of technology. And as you can see from this page, creating a sense of belonging is not a siloed thing. It is end-to-end planning, and it cuts across the different HR COEs or shared services or business partnering areas. And connecting the dots is very important. Otherwise, each COE or HR shared services department would just go about launching its own initiatives and programs without the gluing part, gluing it all together. And so we had to look at enhancing candidate experience, to onboarding them, especially during the COVID lockdown, to using technologies like Qualtrics to conduct pulse surveys with managers and employees, and to everything, e-town hall, virtual fireside chats with leaders, e-Mother's Day concert, as well as, to the larger and external community like our Singtel alumni, the schools, through our brand ambassador programs. And so if I have more time later, I would, be happy to share with you more about the pulse surveys through Qualtrics. Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much for that sharing, Charlton. And please ping through as many questions as you have about this impressive program that we see here at Singtel. I think one of my big takeaways from what you're talking about there is obviously in this digitization journey, making sure that employee is still center and taking that human-centered design in everything that you do. So I think that's a great lesson and takeaway for everyone on the call. Let's take this opportunity then to dive into a bit of a regional perspective, and I think build on that theme by talking a little bit more about well-being. Something that I'm sure is at the fore and has been at the fore for many of you on the call, both at a personal level and in terms of how you support your workforce. So at a regional level, across Asia, we had close to 6,000 responses across 10 different geographies. And again, there's some further reading for you here in terms of 5 ways you can improve both customer experience and employee experience in 2021 for APJ. So we'll direct you to some of those resources after today's webinar. So well-being should not be a surprising theme that we're covering today. We know how the criticality of that really changed against the backdrop of the pandemic. So this went from something that was very niche to certain industries. So yes, it's critical in, say, a manufacturing environment, but potentially in an FSI environment that may look different. It may look, again, like somewhat of an HR-driven program. Yet this was something that suddenly skyrocketed to the top of many executives' agenda during the course of 2020 and beyond. So one of the things we sought to understand in the study is from a well-being perspective, if people were feeling calm and energized at work, if they were feeling positive about themselves, whether they had some of those trusting relationships that helped them build some of that resilience through trying times, and to what extent they were feeling at some stages overwhelmed by some of those responsibilities and some of the changes in flux that they were seeing within their own workspaces. Now, the results of this have been really surprising. We've seen significant differences from a global perspective, from an Asia perspective, and across different geographies. And of course, this brings to us, or this is a useful finding in the sense that it reminds us that something like engagement, something like employee experience is very rarely a one-size-fits-all. We need to be able to segment very carefully our populations in terms of whether it's from a geographic perspective, whether it's from a job type, whether it is specific segments, to be listening in very closely on where are there particular populations we really need to be leaning into from a well-being perspective to providing more support from an organization and from an HR standpoint. So you can see here relatively varied results. Singapore coming out there at only about 56% of the workforce reporting that they felt a strong or a decent sense or solid sense of well-being within their own workspaces. Now, we thought who better to talk us through this theme than Grab. So Grab, of course, is an organization that we're all hugely familiar with. And they really had a dual challenge in 2020. So absolutely, top of mind for them was customer safety and how customers were going to experience their brand during a time where they had to make a lot of shifts. Of course, at the same time, they had to be ever mindful of their own employees' well-being, pivoting current initiatives and putting in place even more measures to make sure that their workforce felt cared for and felt protected during a time of a lot of change and adaptation. So what you see here are some of the core pillars that some of the Grabbers have benefited from over the years as part of the Wellbeing Program. But I'd really like to invite Cornelius on the line to share with us a little bit more about how at Grab you were able to listen and how you were able to respond to some of those emerging employee concerns, specifically during 2020, but also some of those lessons that perhaps you want to take into 2021 and beyond.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for having me, and very happy to be here with you. So good morning to everyone. In terms of how, I guess there were two parts to your question. One was around how we were able to listen and improve that in 2020. I think there were two main things that we did. This one is supplementing existing listening mechanisms, if you will. So like most other companies, we have our traditional engagement survey. We do that twice a year. But we realized in a time of COVID where things were changing so quickly, when new movement control orders were issued almost on a bi-weekly basis, we needed something more frequent. So that led us to roll out things like pulse surveys right throughout the COVID situation, and to get a more frequent check-in with our Grabbers on how the situation was evolving for them, what's been the impact, and what are the biggest challenges they face. The second thing that we did to help us listen better is, beyond these formal mechanisms, relying on a lot of informal, what we would describe as on-the-ground sensors. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back. Just cut off.
Yeah. Okay. So the second thing we did was using what we call on-the-ground sensors. And that started with bringing together very different teams that would give us different insights into our Gravis situations and challenges. So not driven just by people operations or what we call in Grab the POPs team, but we brought together teams from facilities, right, from security, from the local operations teams, and bring us together where we connect on a weekly basis so that we have a stronger, more frequent sense of what our Grabbers are really feeling. And that gives us a multi-dimensional insight and much more frequent touch point to then take action. On the second part of the question around how we responded to the employee concerns, I think the important thing was responding at different levels. So at the first level, there were some things that we responded to kind of grab-wide, right, centrally driven. Whether it's, for example, coming up with the Grabber Care site, which was a microsite we launched very quickly in the COVID situation, to be a one-stop portal for all Grabbers on the latest information. What were the latest restrictions in each country? What is the latest Grab policy for that country, given the movement control orders, tools, tips, and tricks as we evolve and transition to working from home, right, and virtual collaboration. To recognizing that, as you called out, well-being being such a difficult challenge at this time, rolling out well-being focused programs. So we had things like Grab Calm, which is a meditation session that any Grabber can dial into over Zoom. And just for that 30, 45 minutes, have a meditative experience to help kind of recenter, right, in the middle of the day. We had programs like Grab Fuel, which were focused on different tips and tricks and micro-learning sessions to help them build resilience. For leaders, we also had resilient coaching. But the last thing we did centrally that I thought was also really interesting is we tried to foster stronger social connectivity. Especially with everyone working remotely, what causes well-being to drop is the lack of social connectivity with each other. So we started things that could help, whether it's Call Connects, which is a bot we have where two Grabbers can randomly be connected and they can meet for virtual coffee in the middle of the day and just connect as people, right? Not necessarily as team members. To Grab Radio, to have an informal session to share more about what's happening in Grab, introduce different leaders, so on and so forth. Then the other two levels at which we responded was one, empowering local teams, because each country has a different challenge. Each location of work has a different challenge. And so we wanted to make sure we empower local teams to do that. So they had complete authority to repurpose their engagement budget in the context of COVID to solve the local challenges that Grabbers were facing. And then the last one is at the Grabber level, right? Encouraging them to experiment, because we don't have all the answers. So how do we encourage them to experiment with different response actions and then trying to surface the best ones and scale them? So an example of that I can share is early on in COVID, we had some leaders who started sending out care packages to their teams, right? Not by request of Grab, but just deciding that, hey, it'd probably be a good idea to send some masks, some gloves, hand sanitizer, whatnot to their teams. And that movement caught fire, right? And other leaders started doing that. So encouraging Grabbers to experiment and then scaling the great ideas to inspire others.
Thanks so much, Cornelius. That's such great sharing. And certainly maybe one day I'm going to ask you for that link so that I can also dial into Grab Calm. That sounds like a great little oasis in the day for sure. And a lot of what you've spoken about, we're actually going to now start having a look at when we look at some of the trends we saw in Singapore specifically. So a couple of key takeaways that I had from your side was really around the importance of upping the frequency of that listening, particularly during times of change. And how, upping that listening, that frequency also meant that you had to create more collaboration. So be able to cascade some of those insights down to the operational level so you could really get that collaboration going on the ground, because everything can't be centrally driven. It's got to be bottom down and top up, and it's really got to be sort of all hands on deck when it comes to making action happen. Also really loved your points about experimentation and knowing that actually many people on the ground might have some innovative solutions or some new ways if we're tapping in to those, and if we're able to disseminate those at scale. So really great insights, and we've seen loads of questions coming through on the chat, so please keep those coming through for Charlton or any of the other panelists that we have. Cornelius, or any of the other panelists we have. So let's have a look at some of the Singapore-specific trends. So I think some of these are preempted a little bit, in the sense that one of the things that you'll already see is that year on year we've seen some significant improvements. And one of the standout things we've seen is that regularity of listening. Exactly to what was shared in the previous example, many organizations realized that a once-a-year annual survey was probably a bit too rigid during that time, and they needed to lean in at multiple listening points and for multiple purposes to really be able to understand what the sentiment was on the ground and where there were gaps that they needed to start closing. From an engagement perspective, we have seen some progress, but again, as I mentioned, still a lag behind global in terms of both engagement and intention to stay, suggesting that we have a fair amount more to do as organizations when it comes to how do we translate this listening into key insights, multidimensional insights, I think was the word used in our previous case study, so that we can empower our managers to take action. And really that taking action is going to be the third theme that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment, which is it's great that we activate and we create all of these insights, but we're still seeing the biggest gap both globally and at a local level in terms of taking action on that feedback. So let's do a quick revisit of some of the top engagement drivers in Singapore. So to the first theme that we explored, belonging, coming to the fore both in the Singapore context, the regional context, and global. The second being around continuous ways of improving the way in which work gets done. So again, this linking to some of the well-being outcomes and some of our changing worlds of work, employees looking more and more to their organizations to find ways to streamline their work and really enable them to be able to achieve the outcomes they're expected to achieve. And then the final three are probably ones that are more traditionally seen as our top drivers. So things around the clarity of direction from senior leadership, and we see collaboration come through there twice, a word that was used quite a lot in our previous case studies. So how effective is my manager at role modeling effective collaboration, and is there effective collaboration between the teams? Even more challenging in our digital environments, which is part of some of the questions that we're going to cover off on in our panel coming up. But before we get to some of those themes, let's talk a little bit around why acting on feedback is so critical. So if we have a look at a global perspective on this and some of our key outcomes around engagement, well-being, and intention to stay, you can see a massive gap in the indicators between those organizations that are low on taking action and those that are high on taking action. So those that have really been able to empower those or take the insights that they collect from this intensified listening and be able to translate that into insights that managers, HR practitioners, and those that are taking action in the business can access quickly and then translate those into action are certainly outperforming on each of these three areas. If we dive into some of that Singapore-specific data, we still see a lot of gaps in terms of the feedback action gap. So even though 93% believe that this is really important, and 74% believe that they have the opportunity to give feedback, there's only 21% that are saying, actually, my company acts really well on the feedback that I provide. Of course, this is something we really need to be really mindful of because the more listening we are doing, the more the expectation can be from our workforce around how is this translating. And we find in organizations that are doing well, employees are more likely to give transparent, give candid feedback, and give useful insight when they know that that is being taken seriously by their organization. So let's lean in here to a specific example from Standard Chartered. So we know Standard Chartered has been talking employee experience for many years. We have Dilip on the line, who is actually their head of employee listening. So certainly a true subject matter expert in this area. And they've incurred sort of a number of lessons over the years when it comes to maturing this program, and certainly have in mind for the future some significant pivots that they need to make. So Dilip, could you perhaps tell us a bit more about how your employee experience program has evolved at Standard Chartered? Particularly focus in on how you're closing that gap between listening and employees experiencing action at the employee level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me here. Really great to talk to you all. So we've been running our annual engagement program for several years now. It's really well embedded in the business. We've got an annual engagement survey, and we get approximately a 91% response rate across 86,000 employees in 59 different countries. So it's really well adopted by the business. It runs in 8 different languages. And we've recently broadened out our employee listening program to include continuous listening. So we now have a rolling culture survey that goes out weekly to a subset of organizations, a subset of people in the organization every week. We've launched Moments That Matter surveys. So we've got a variety of touch points across our colleague journey where we tap into those critical experiences that we all go through. And that could be onboarding, it could be moving to a new role, it could be becoming a parent, those critical points in any employee's life. That it's absolutely essential to get right if you want people to have a positive experience in the organization. So and then what we're also really passionate about is decentralization. As an employee listening function, we don't want to be the custodians of that data, producing reports for all of the different organization, all the different people across the organization. One, that creates a massive capacity constraint, and also we're somewhat remote from some of the issues on the ground. So we need to put that power into the hands of people who are on the ground facing issues and need people data in order to be able to solve those problems. And then we provide the services and the support in order to enable them to be able to do that. So really getting out of their way. The other aspect that we're really focused on at the moment is going beyond traditional surveys, so moving into interactive listening methods, looking at virtual focus groups, looking at passive listening, looking at unstructured analytics, natural language processing, and text analytics in order to get deeper and richer insights from the data that's available at the moment. And I'm sure we kind of can see the direction of travel, that technology is going to evolve rapidly over the next 5 years. So getting into that space now and making sure that we're listening in those new and innovative ways is absolutely the direction that we need to be heading in. So in terms of taking action, so what does that mean? So we've got all of this data and we're working really closely with it. But in terms of taking action, first principles for me is you've got to be asking the right questions, right? You've got to be going out there and tapping into things that the business cares about, and making sure that not only are you asking questions aligned to the business strategy, aligned to the people strategy, but also things that are actually directly actionable. We don't go out and ask about everything. You want to ask about things that you actually have an appetite or an intent to change. So that's critical in terms of being able to do something with the data. The other thing that we really do is we make data transparent. We're the custodians of that data. We enable people to access it, and we provide the tools and the guardrails around that and the governance. But absolutely, we provide that global, regional, country data to anyone in the business who can access that through a dashboard and use it for the purposes that they need. And as I mentioned, we do it through a distributed model. We have survey champions in absolutely every country and each region, and they are responsible for dissemination of the findings from all of this data sources. And helping the business to interpret that and relate it back to the organizational priorities that they have. So they're absolutely critical to the success of our initiative. And then finally, I would say that, so tools and education around that. So there's a big push in the organization at the moment to make people data as much of a currency as other sources of data, such as customer data or performance data. Understanding how well your people are doing is absolutely a driver of that customer experience. It's a driver of that business experience. So really critical that we are able to make those connections and enable and make that relevance to people. And then we give people action planning tools within all of our platforms. That's all pre-populated with good practice. So we don't just say, go off and here's some data, here's some insights, now go and do your own action plan. We actually give them the best practice, and they can adopt that, they can edit it, they can change it, they can use that to track if they want. We don't mandate it. We're very much of the view that we provide the tools and the opportunity and the service for people to be able to do that, and we create a culture where people want to do that, and they see the value in doing it. So that's how we drive our adoption. And absolutely, we try to get people not to drive action for action's sake. Action has to be aligned. There's always a tendency when people see results to go for a knee-jerk reaction to let's kick off 5 different new initiatives. Well, actually, there's probably 6 or 7 things that we're already doing, which we're tracking against each of these things. So this should be for course correction, it should be for iteration, and where there's a gap, it should be for new initiatives, but absolutely not just for that sake.
Awesome. These are such great insights, Philippe. And there's so much, so many takeaways here for me, and so many things that really echo or resonate from my side. I think, firstly, that theme around that democratization of data being really critical, and certainly being a direction that Qualtrics is hugely supportive of. We have a value set called TACOs, and the T stands for transparency. So it's something that we both live internally and we promote with our clients as well. The second key takeaway there for me is really around the importance of being clear around what is the role of those that facilitate the employee listening and the employee action program. So very much being facilitators versus custodians. So I heard you talk about putting in guardrails, enabling through best practice, making sure people have the right tools and the right insights at the right time, making sure that they understand what are some of the broader initiatives they can link in with, versus everything sort of falling on a small team, which creates a huge bottleneck in terms of how things need to be done in an organization. So really useful insights, and thanks for sharing. And I can see a lot of great questions coming through on the chat. So I hope we can get to a number of them, and please keep them coming through. Of course, any we aren't able to get to in the Q&A, we will certainly follow up with you after this call. So without further ado, let us get into our panel discussion. So 2020 has certainly been a year of disruption in employee experience, but more than disruption, it's been an opportunity. It's been an opportunity to lean in, to listen more, to take more action, and be able to design and improve employee experiences for the future. So Karina, I'd love to hand over to you to pose to the panel questions that you think will be relevant and interesting to our audience today.
Sure, thank you, Lauren. I'm just gonna kick off with a few questions that I thought would be good to recap some of the things that we've heard based on your sharing of that very rich survey that you've done. And then I've also been keeping track of some of the questions that's coming through Q&A, so I've got some of that as well. So I'm gonna try and keep pace the time here. So I think the first thing I wanted to sort of find out, I guess, from Cornelius for some insights and sharing is that Lauren had, shared in his presentation slide that there are actually different engagement scores that we are seeing reflected across the globe, APAC, and some of the Southeast Asia countries, in the graph that she's shared. So, and we also know that it's often not a one-size-fits-all approach to rolling out engagement programs. So I was wondering, Cornelius, if you can share, what considerations should we bear in mind when we look at this multi-country program rollouts, especially, bearing in mind the different segments of the workforce, including gig workers?
Sure. Thank you, Karina. So I think the most important consideration is just to take into account what the data is telling us from different countries, and in fact not just countries, right, but also different segments. Whether it's there was a question in the Q&A about age. That could be one. It could be by different levels of the organization. So looking at the data to understand the, if you will, segmentized needs, right? And how do we best respond to those? I'll share some insights from Grab about what some of the things we found when we looked across countries, and there were two very interesting themes that we realized were important considerations. The first one was the local infrastructure when you go country by country. So for example, in Grab, when most countries started to enter into working from home arrangements and movement control restrictions, very quickly after that, we realized that Singapore probably had no issue with working from home from an infrastructure point of view. Most of us have fairly stable internet connections. We're able to do that quite well. But we realized that that was a huge pain point for our colleagues in Indonesia, right? Where for a surprisingly large number of Grabbers, they were working from homes with no wired internet connection. So you can imagine the poor Grabber trying to connect on their mobile phone as a hotspot and trying to work for weeks on ends and the kind of mobile phone bills that they would have been racking up. So how do we solve for that challenge versus trying to drive a kind of Grab-wide engagement that would not really address the issue that they're facing? So that was one consideration. What's the local infrastructure, and therefore how does that affect the challenge faced by Grabbers there? The second one was also the diversity and, if you will, the localization of the workforce and what that meant. So using Singapore as an example, one of the things we realized was in Singapore, Grab has a very diverse workforce. We have a lot of Grabbers whose families are not here, whose families are based somewhere else, right? And it could be the UK, the US, Australia, India, China, so on and so forth. But for them, we realized that as the COVID situation dragged on longer and longer, this was weighing heavier and heavier on them, the inability to go home and see their families and be with their families. And that wasn't really the challenge that we would have in some of our other locations, whether it's in Thailand, right, where a lot of them were local Thai employees. So then how do we help solve for that challenge? So those were two interesting considerations that emerged from our data as we looked across countries.
Great, thanks so much. I think that also, helped address some of the questions that come out in Q&A. I think there was a question posed regarding, with everyone going virtually, what are some of the support that organizations can provide for those who may not have the best infrastructure. But out of curiosity, a follow-up question to Cornelius is, you mentioned, that it's taking its toll, especially for folks working in Singapore and not being able to see their families. What were some of the things that Grab was able to put in place to support them with this regards?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I can share about, which I think also there was a question around allowing employees to go back and visit their home countries, right, during these times.
Yeah.
So the thing that Grab introduced quite early on was what we call the WOLE policy, which is an acronym for working outside of location of employment. But everyone in Grab refers to it as the WOLE policy now. And the idea and the intent there was for these Grabbers who are facing family circumstances. Maybe it's an aging parent, maybe it's a parent who's fallen ill, maybe it's a sibling, right? Who needed to head home. Then we have a policy that allows them to, for at least part of the time that they are away, work remotely, and the rest of that to use their annual leave. So that was a policy that helped quite a number of Grabbers. Now, the challenge, of course, is that policy is also still subject to different government restrictions, right? So the biggest challenge in Singapore is even with that policy supporting them, there is always the risk that the government will not allow for their return. And that's a separate challenge that we've been working to address.
Yeah, I think definitely very important to bear in mind as we're looking at the various ways and then adopting some of the practices from different organizations that it's fit for purpose, especially with the country considerations. Thank you, Cornelius. Maybe now I can turn to Charlton. I think, one of the things that that Lauren had brought up during her presentation was how important it was that employees see that their leaders are acting on their feedback, right? It's one thing to put in place a more frequent pulsing just to find out what's the mindset or psyche of the workforce. But then, we need to make sure that there is also interventions put in place. Maybe HR needs to coach and guide leaders as they engage with the workforce. So just interested to hear from your perspective, how can HR guide leaders towards this mindset of trust, especially with the continued default work from home policies?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. It's one important one as well. But before we guide managers and leaders, first of all, we need data. We need data to analyze and see what are the actions that we need to take. So at the start of the COVID lockdown here in Singapore, we rolled out pulse survey on a regular basis, weekly. Then later on, as things got better, we rolled out, we reduced to like bi-weekly and then monthly and so on. One of the initial pulse survey that we rolled out using Qualtrics is kind of asking, our employees who are working remotely or at home, from home, what are some of the top challenges that they face? And so we collected a list of about 10 reasons, 10 themes, if you will. Number 3 on the list is around leadership empathy, or lack of, kind of saying that my leaders don't empathize with me and so on and so forth. Number 1 was work hours, the length of, work. Number 2 was home condition that was not conducive. But number 3, importantly, is around leadership empathy. And so with that data, we also had verbatim as well. The tool allows us to collect verbatim data. We were able to sort of segregate them by department and go in on a more focused approach, and of course sharing anonymously with confidentially with the respective directors, department directors, and managers in charge. Right? What are some of the things that they need to pay attention to in terms of reaching out more to their employees? We also came up with some toolkits, manager toolkits around, effective communication, team engagement, performance management during the circuit breaker, and how to reach out to employees. We asked our managers to do morning check-in and evening check-in. It's check-in and not check-on. Yeah, I think that's the key difference. And we put these toolkits also inside our online a learning portal, and it's which we internally call it Curious, and everybody has access to Curious as long as you are able to access our system from home. And this kind of ties to one of the questions I saw from Ms. Joanne Yap. around kind of do we provide, how do we ensure that our employees have the necessary technology and how to access information. And the answer is that, first of all, we give everyone a laptop, but of course there are people who are still using desktops and that's their preference. But as long as your job allows you to work remotely, we ask that you have a laptop and but of course you have to download all the security protocols and VPNs, and then Teams, Microsoft Teams, so that we also can communicate and so on. So that answers that question. But coming back to our leaders, right? Apart from what I shared earlier, I think another point another data is our Your Voice survey, we call it, which is our annual employee climate survey, usually around November period. So this was based on November 2020, kind of at the end of more, I guess, phase 3. Singapore entered into phase 3. And the information we got there, that data, was that managers who are disengaged, right? Leaders who are disengaged are more prone to having employees who report to them that are disengaged, okay? Managers, and the reverse is true. Managers or leaders who are engaged, their employees are more engaged. And so therefore, the importance is on training this group of leaders of management, middle management, to ensure that they know how to reach out to their teams, they know how to behave themselves in the right way, right, that the company expects of them. And that is something that in the new budget year that's coming up, we will continue to focus on, which is the continuous development of our leadership leaders. Yeah. So that's something that will continue. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Charlton. I think it's a great reminder that, as we're working with our leaders to better engage their direct reports and teams, it's critical that the organization is looking at supporting the leaders themselves, because I think the leaders are really going through quite a lot of stress as well themselves, right? Having to keep business going, managing their teams virtually and so on. So definitely a good reminder for that. If I may now maybe pass the next question over to Dilip. I think we talked a lot about, because different countries are still in various stages of lockdown, movement control, and so on, that, we are actually going into the next stage where organizations are looking at a hybrid workforce management, right? There are people where are more comfortable working from home. There are others who actually prefer to work from the office, given that it does take its toll, especially if your work environment, your home environment, is not as conducive for working from home in a prolonged period. So maybe can you share a little bit more about, what your thoughts are regarding how can we best manage this hybrid work arrangement and hybrid workforce?
Yeah, so we found last year when we ran our employee engagement survey, I'll go back a bit further. We ran a pulse survey on COVID. We also ran a survey on home working. We'd been previously looking at office working, so we were able to compare directly the home responses and the office responses. And we also then asked the entire workforce within in the annual engagement survey, where they wanted to spend their time, and it went from, we asked the question, where did you spend your time before lockdown, and how much time would you like to spend in the office in future? And it went from about 30% of the organization, saying that they work less, most people saying that they work less than a day at home a week, and that to over 75% of the organization saying that they wanted to work at home 3 or more days going forwards. So obviously, absolutely monumental shift in preferences. Now, we've been pushing an agenda of flexible working for many years, and the adoption has been relatively low. So this has been an absolutely massive catalyst for a shift to a genuinely hybrid model. And we're not talking about flexible working anymore. We're talking about hybrid, talking about the fact that there will be a combination of office work and home work, but also reimagining what that office work would look like. You know, it being a space for collaboration, it being a space for innovation, you know, and coming together to do those types of activities that require face-to-face interaction. So yeah, firstly, rethinking based on the data as to what our approach should be. This led to us kicking off a project called Future Work Now. And we have been over the last year looking at how we're going to transition from one model to this genuine hybrid model. And you know, we have recently launched in 8 markets a pilot where we're offering flexible working contracts to the vast majority of the workforce. So it's being, but we're doing that on multiple fronts. So there's a contractual element, there's a cultural element that we're focused on. We're also focused on, you know, the employee experience of that. You know, what's the journey like? How do I find information about that? How do I apply for that? How do I talk to my manager about that? You know, how do managers talk to their people about that? You know, and figuring out kind of what the right way to navigate through this is. And I think obviously where we are at the moment in the world, we're looking at future focus at a time when we're still not entirely settled on the now. You know, we don't know when lockdowns are going to end. We don't know when, you know, different markets are going to come through this crisis. So we're, you know, we're very much aware that we need to continue to listen throughout this process. So we'll do that through our employee engagement. By our rolling culture survey, we'll be able to track trend on sentiment over time around, you know, how's that working out for people. We'll be able to do that through the annual engagement survey. We'll look at like what is the critical information that people need, or the support that they need in order to make themselves successful at hybrid. What are the new technology support resources, all of those sorts of things that need to be in place in order to make this work, so that, you know, we can continually course correct as we're all entering into uncharted territory here. You know, this is totally new to the whole world, and we have to think through some of the complexities, and we have to experiment and not be afraid to experiment either. You know, we're you know, well aware that this isn't a tried and tested path. So there will be a whole piece of work that we're going to do around how do we track the success of this? How do we measure the success? How do we link this employee sentiment data to business outcome data? And I'm on the measurement steering committee in terms of how we're going to go about doing that, bringing together multiple different data sources in order to kind of track, you know, our effectiveness at this.
That's great. Wow, looks like you've got your work cut out for you, as we, you know, have to be kind of, as they say, flying the plane while building it, in terms of putting in place the policies, the tools, and even very importantly, as you mentioned, the success measures, right? The business case for that. And that actually segues very nicely to my question to Lauren, perhaps, given that Qualtrics have been working with your clients on looking into, you know, policy in the organization and building a business case for employee listening. Maybe you can share a couple of insights with the audience.
Sure. So, I mean, of course, a business case means many things to many different people. So, you know, from our perspective, there's probably 3 ways in which we work with clients to help them articulate the business case for designing and improving on employee experiences. So the first is to look externally. So look at the broad body of literature that has been evolving over the last number of years around the linkages between constructs like engagement and revenue, engagement and lower turnover, engagement and higher productivity. You know, you will find some well-validated sources from the likes of Gartner, from the likes of Forrester, that can be really foundational in building that business case. That being said, I think that those statistics sometimes only get you so far because they can feel a bit academic to potentially some of the audiences that you need to pitch to. So I think making that real with case studies can be hugely impactful. So again, there you can reach out to us or use some examples from some of what you've heard on the call today of organizations that are similar to yours, potentially in your own industry or facing similar challenges, and what are some of the outcomes that they've been able to drive. So I'll use an example here of one of our Forbes 500 clients. And, you know, for them, one of their key business drivers was around improving efficiency. So being able to bring all their employee insights onto one platform that could then translate into action dashboards for all of their managers meant 66% reduction in their costs and a 10% speed to action. And obviously everything sort of being housed, all their data being housed in one powerful platform. We also have other clients that perhaps have goals that are more client related. So for example, they have certain CX goals that they want to meet. They have an NPS that they're trying to drive. And we're starting to see those correlations between our eNPSs and our NPSs. So our engagement scores and our net promoter scores from a customer base. We're also seeing statistics that suggest that this is helping organizations drive innovation to meet their reputation goals. So really it's good to know from your organizational standpoint, what are some of the key levers that are really important to your leadership to make sure that we can find those case studies that can help you build that business case. And so that's the second. And then the third is really around how are you responding to some of those new needs? So how do you build those business case in relation to, so I think Dilip used the word, you know, these are sort of new times, these are unprecedented times. We've heard the word experiment from two of our panelists as well. So we want to make sure that we're doing that, but with some guardrails and with some data. So how are you making sure that, you know, when you're building the business case as well, you're not just talking about the past, but you're talking about emerging needs and about future-proofing your program. And so how are you putting in place an infrastructure that's going to be responsive and adaptive to new constructs that you may need to measure and to respond to over time?
Wow, thank you. I love how, you know, you put it in threes, right? You know, look at the body of literature externally, and then maybe, you know, we can work with you to drop some of these, you know, interesting publications from Gartner, Forrester, and so on that can be helpful for our audience post the session. And I think we're already hearing quite rich sort of case studies provided by Charlton, Cornelius, and Dilip and yourself. And then lastly, as you mentioned, not just basing the data on the past, but because we are dealing with very unprecedented times, there's no sort of, you know, guide on what's coming up in the future. So also bearing in mind, you know, to build the business case and incorporate some of the emerging needs to future-proof the organization. Thank you so much. I think now I'm going to, you know, take a look at the list of questions that's come up. And I think some of you have been using the upvote function. I see that Cornelius has actually been proactive. He would like to answer the top question live, which is from Su Hui, about how do you balance stretching employees to build competencies and improving their well-being by making sure they're not too overwhelmed. Cornelius, over to you. And then any of the panelists, feel free to chime in to add on if you've got additional thoughts to share.
Sure. I thought it was such a great question to have a discussion around. That's why I thought let's do this live, because I'm sure the other panelists also have different insights and inputs on this. So from my side, I think it's exactly the balance that we're trying to strike. And at least for Grab, the way we're trying to approach that balance is by doing a few things. One, raising the awareness of the Grabbers towards how they're feeling. Right? So the biggest challenge, especially for us in Grab, because a lot of our Grabbers are very young. The average age within Grab is, I think, less than 30. So with the youth also comes less experience. And the first thing we needed to do is raise that consciousness, that awareness of how they're feeling so that they can check in for themselves and realize when they're becoming overstretched and be able to raise that flag. Because it's very hard to take action otherwise, right? If they just basically drive themselves to burnout and then suddenly there's this huge crash, it's kind of too late to do anything. So that was one. The second thing we needed to do is then help build the capabilities, and we're trying to do that also now this year, help build the capabilities of team leaders and managers to be able to watch out for that, right? Watch out for symptoms where someone is becoming overstretched, where someone is getting to the point of paralysis, right? Being unable to work effectively anymore. And how do you, as a team leader, as a manager, take action there? So that's the second thing that we did and are doing to try and help balance the stretch with building the skills, the competencies, both of the graduates themselves as well as of their managers and team leaders to manage that balance.
I like that, teaching, because I think, sometimes even if we're training the managers or guiding them to watch for symptoms, it may not always be possible. So I love the fact that you're also equipping the employees to watch out for the own, the symptoms themselves and to flag it, giving them the forums and that, psychological safety to flag all of this.
Yeah, and maybe one last point on that, Karina, and I would love to hear from the other panelists is once we give them that awareness and that consciousness, is also making sure we've created the right infrastructure and support mechanisms for them to go to, right? If they're aware of the problem, but there's nowhere to get help, that doesn't really help them. So it's making sure that all of those avenues, platforms, infrastructure is there to support them. They know how to tap into those, and then it can work.
Great. Dilip, Charlton, would you like to add in, or even Lauren?
Yeah, I agree with whatever Cornelius said about, striking a balance and, taking charge of one's well-being. But when it comes to competencies, building competencies, I would also like to say that it's also important to go in with the right mindset. It is taking charge about building your own competencies. And that, you only build competencies. Why? Because one, it's for your own career, your job. Two, it's to continue to stay relevant, right? Now with the technological advances around us, it's even technical skill sets that can expire within or change within a short time. And so therefore, it is important to continue to keep up, to unlearn, learn, relearn. And I think that's an important mindset to have. Because if you feel that, you're being pressurized to upgrade your own competencies or hone your competencies, I think that is the wrong foot forward. That's what I think, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that, stretch and well-being are not necessarily contradictory, right? Stretch can be inspiring. Stretch can force you to rethink what you're doing, innovate, to be creative. The challenge is you have to have capacity, you have to have enough resilience in order to be able to do that. So focusing on making sure that people have appropriate support around them, that they have adequate skill sets in order to manage their workload and have challenging conversations with their leaders where needed if things need to be rebalanced. So stretch, I wouldn't put the two as opposite. I would absolutely focus on, providing, there's actually sometimes nothing worse for your well-being than not feeling stretched at all, right? If everything's banal and not very exciting for you, then that's going to make you fed up as well. So it's a balance. You have to provide enough stretch, but with adequate support.
Yeah, I really like that. I think, it sort of echoes what Cornelia said. It's like really, as the workers, we encourage them to look at their workload, to look at if they have capacity, raise it, have that kind of conversation with their managers that they're up for a stretch, but equally, be comfortable to share and then transparent if the workload is getting a bit too much for them, especially with balancing the work from home, family life and all that. I think we're blurring the lines. So great insights there. I'm mindful of time. We have about 2 more minutes. So maybe if, I know that there are some questions that have been left unanswered. We'll be working with all the speakers and panelists to make sure that, we do get a response back to everyone. So do keep a lookout for the follow-up email that we'll send out with the webinar recording. But we can go on to the next few slides, Lauren. Great. I think this slide really talks about some key takeaways, and you find that in the follow-up pack. But for me, I think if I just kind of reflect on what I've heard this morning, very key thing is it's not a one size fits all when it comes to employee engagement. So we do need to be mindful about the demographics needs, as well as also be cognizant of what's happening at the country level. What the government, advisories and policies are. Very, prominent across all the speakers I've heard about data insights, right? Equipping yourself with the right data, supplementing the listening channels, throughout this time so that you can gather more insights. So, and then lastly, I think listening and acting on feedback. While you're gathering all this information, I think don't be remiss to not act on it quickly enough, because there's rising expectations for employees for that. So as mentioned, if you could scan the QR code and do give us your feedback and insights while all the information is still fresh in your minds. And without further ado, I just want to give a big thank you and shout out to Qualtrics for your great partnership, for the rich insights that you shared, and definitely not to miss out on Charlton, Cornelius, and Dilip for really giving us your time, in terms of prepping for this and also sharing such wonderful insights with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, everyone.